To lesson 18, understanding the quadratic formula. It's the last lesson in our course. I know you're excited, so let's get started. We've got 4 learning objectives. First, we're going to learn the parts of the quadratic equation or formula. Here's what it looks like. And each of these little pieces here has a part. What's most important here is the discriminant, which is just what I circled underneath the radical sign. We're going to find the discriminant first, and we're going to use what we get from the discriminant to figure out if there's no 1 or 2 solutions. If it's negative, there's no solutions. If it's 0, there's 1. And if it's a positive number, there's 2 solutions. If you remember last lesson, we looked at a graph like this one here. This one crosses this parabola, crosses this graph twice, so there's 2 solutions. If you remember, some look like what I just drew here, didn't touch the graph or cross it, so there's no solutions, and then there are a few that would just touch it once. And when we said last lesson that had 1 solution. And then finally, we're going to use a quadratic formula to solve a quadratic function. A couple of things you must know. One is the quadratic function, which is ax squared plus bx plus c. That's equal to 0. You know that from our last couple of lessons. You need to know the parts of the parabola. So you've got your vertex, which is your turning point. This parabola is a valley. So remember, valleys equal a minimum number. In hills means there's a maximum value. We also have your roots. Your roots are also your solutions or your zeros. You got your axis of symmetry, which is the imaginary line that cuts our parabola in half. And that's where it's whatever the x value is of our vertex. So this one, it looks like it's 2. If you look at these 2 roots here, if you go to x equal 2 on the number line, the root to the right is 2 units away. The root to the left is 2 units to the way. At every dot is always equal distance from that axis of symmetry. You're going to need to know how to plot points. You're going to need to know the range and domain. Once again, the range, that's our input. It's the number we put into a math problem, a formula, an equation. And your domain is your answer. Of course, we like to call that output. And you need to know square roots. So in just a second, I'll show you square roots as they apply to the quadratic formula. And there you go, as promised. The square root of a number includes 2 options. It includes the positive version of that number and the negative. For example, negative 3 squared is negative 3 times negative 3, or positive 9. Here we squared negative 3. The inverse operation of squaring is taking the square root. So the square root of 9 could either be plus or minus 3. Oftentimes, you'll see it written as this plus or minus 3 or plus or minus 3 like I did here. And this just means or. We're not dividing. I know it looks like your division fraction bar, but really the way to read it is positive or negative 3. The square root of 0, well, that's just 0. Square root of 1 is 1. And once again, it's positive 1 or negative 1. Which is why we have this plus slash negative 1, right? This is saying it's a positive 1 or it's a negative 1. And then the square root of a negative number is imaginary. So for the rest of this course, we're going to say there's no solution. If you go on and take Algebra 2, you'll learn about imaginary numbers and you'll come up with imaginary solutions. For this course, because in Algebra 1 we just deal with real numbers, we're going to say it's no solution. And it's critical that we take the positive and the negative version of the number, because remember, sometimes your quadratic, in our parabola, always has two intersections, right? So when we take the positive and negative square root, we're going to take into account both roots, both zeros, both solutions. And don't worry if that doesn't make sense right now. As we work through this lesson, we'll keep revisiting this, and by the end, it should make sense. Okay, so our quadratic function, your a is your x squared coefficient. That's always got to be positive. B is your x coefficient, and C is our constant. We use the quadratic function and the quadratic formula to figure out the roots or the solutions of a parabola. So the quadratic formula is derived from the quadratic function. Once again, that's something you'll do in Algebra 2. You'll do this thing called completing the square. And when you complete the square, you derive the quadratic formula. So your quadratic formula is going to be your negative b. I don't know why that's there. It's going to be your negative b plus or minus the square root of your discriminant. Your discriminant is b squared minus 4ac. Then you're going to divide that by 2a. So how this formula works is first you're going to find your discriminant. So first you're going to find your discriminant, which we're going to call d. Second, you're going to take the square root of d, which is your discriminant. Third, you're going to take your negative b and you're going to add it to the square root of d. And then next, you're going to take this negative b and you're going to subtract the square root of d. I know the symbols here makes it look complicated. It's really not. We're going to take it step by step. Our first step, once again, is to figure out what the discriminant is. We're going to take the square root of that if we can. If it's negative, there's no solution. And then once we take the square root of the discriminant, we're going to add it to negative b. Then we're going to divide that answer by 2a. Then we're going to take negative b, subtract the square root of the discriminant, divide that by 2a, and those will be our solutions. So just once again, to break it down, the a, b, and c are coefficients from our quadratic and standard form. The plus and minus sign means there's two possible answers. So we're going to work the second half of the formula twice. Once will be worked by adding the discriminant. The second time we'll subtract it. The operation under the radical side is called the discriminant. It helps us determine the number of solutions and whether our solutions are real or imaginary. And just like the last lesson with parabolas, we'll either have no solution, one solution, or two solutions. 2a is just a magical number, and it does come from completing the square, but it helps us to do this fancy math. And finally, we use the quadratic formula when factoring or graphing is just too difficult. And there's a lot of times that you'll have a parabola and it doesn't go through a lattice point on the x-axis. The quadratic formula will allow us to get a more exact answer. But with that said, in this lesson, all of our answers are going to be integers, because integers are just easier than decimals and fractions, because I really want you to get the skill of solving the quadratic formula down before we make anything more complicated than necessary. So the discriminant, I keep talking about the discriminant. Your discriminant is underneath the radical sign. It's b squared minus 4ac, where a, b, and c are read from our quadratic function or from our quadratic function. A positive discriminant, which means it's larger than 0, right? Bigger than 0. larger than 0, well, we have two solutions. It's going to cross that x-axis twice. If our discriminant is equal to 0, and remember the square root of 0 is 0, it's going to just have one solution. It's just going to touch it. And if it's negative, if it's less than 0, it's not going to touch or cross your x-axis, so we say there's no solutions. So the quadratic formula, we got a 4-step process here, and we're going to work through each of these steps one at a time. But step 1, we're going to find the discriminant. Step 2, we're going to take the square root of the discriminant. Your discriminant could be negative, which means there's no solution. It could be 0, which means there's one solution. Or it could be positive, in which case we'll have two solutions. Then step 3, we're going to create a new equation. And really by a new equation, we're going to simplify the quadratic formula down to something that's a little bit easier to deal with. And to do that, we're going to take negative b and we're going to add or subtract the square root of d. And then once we do that, we'll divide that answer by 2a, or 2 times a. And finally, step 4, we're going to work the equation twice. So the first time we're adding negative b to the discriminant. Second, we're adding negative b. The second time, we're subtracting negative b. So let's start off by figuring out how to get the discriminant. Because if you get the discriminant, it's going to be super easy. And once again, your discriminant is this right here. It's b squared minus 4 times a times c. And what I like to do when I practice, or when I'm finding the discriminant, I like to rewrite my discriminant with parentheses for placeholders. So whatever b is, I'll plug in here. Whatever a is, I'll plug in here. And finally, whatever b is, I'll plug into the last parentheses. So we've got this quadratic function. Step 1 is to figure out what a is, and that's your x squared coefficient. Step 2 is to figure out what your b is, and that's your x coefficient. And step C is to figure out what your constant is. And when you figure this out, you've got to include the positive or negative sign. And remember, a negative 5, or in this case, subtracting 5, is the same thing as negative 5. So take a moment, identify A, B, and C. So you should have A as negative 8, B as negative 5, and C as negative 2. Got it written a little bit cleaner here. So remember, once again, we're going to, D means discriminant. I'm going to write with parentheses for my placeholders. So what goes in my first one is my B, which is negative 5. What goes in my second one is A, which is negative 8. So I'm writing negative 8 here. Last one is C, which would be negative 2. So pay attention to your signs. We've got a lot of negatives in this one. And remember, a negative times a negative is what? That's right. A negative times a negative is a positive. So you have a negative 5 times a negative 5, which is going to give you some number. From that, you're going to subtract 4 times negative 8 minus 2. We've got to remember PEMDAS. So right here, before we subtract, we've got to multiply 4 and 8. And then whatever that number is, you got to multiply times 2. Remember, a negative times a negative is a positive, so you have a positive number times a negative 2. So your final answer here would be some kind of negative number. I'll pause the video, and I'll give you a moment to work this out. So I got it cleaned up a little bit better here. So you should have -5 times -5. I came up with 25. So this is 25 here. And then what I like to do is a negative times a negative is a positive. So I'm going to do 4 times 8, which is 32. Then I'm going to multiply 32 times -2. Well, I know a positive times a negative is a negative. I'm going to go ahead and write that negative sign first. Then I'm going to double 32. Well, 2 times 2 is 4. So write down my 4. Nothing to carry. 2 times 3 is 6. So I got -64. Looking at this, is my final answer. Is it going to be positive or negative? What do you think? Well, I came up with a -39. And since in this course, we're not able to take the square root of a negative number, there's no solution, so we stop. So on your, if it's a quiz, and you get a negative in your discriminant, you say there's no solution. Or your practice is when you get to a negative in your discriminant, it's going to be no solution. Just look at another one. So first, we're going to find our discriminant, which is D. And then we're going to figure out what B squared is. So we're going to plug in B here. So that's 10 minus 4 times A. A was 1. Remember what C is? That's right, C was 6. So whatever 10 squared is, we're going to write that down. And then whatever 4 times 1 times 6 is, we're going to write that down. Remember, we're multiplying a -4 times a positive 1. Give you a moment. You can pause the video. So I said 10 times 10 was 100, because it is. 10 times 10 is 100. And then -4 times 1 gave me -4. And then -4 times 6 gave me -24. 100 minus 24, it's 76. Right now we're just working with a discriminant. So with this positive discriminant, we know if we finish this problem, we would have 2 solutions. Let's look at one more discriminant to practice. So now, you need to figure out what your A is, you need to figure out what your B is, you need to figure out what your C is. Once you do that, we're going to write our parentheses with our, we're going to use these parentheses as placeholders. Nothing wrong with labeling them underneath like you see me do here. So what's A? I don't see a number here. If you don't see a number, what's it understood to be? That's right, it's 1. So put in your A, B, and C, and if you want, pause the video and go ahead and try to complete it as much as you can. So I've got -1 for A, B's -4, and C's -4. So my current formula should look something like this. Because remember, our first parentheses is B minus 4. Well, the second one was A. What's A? That's right, -1 times C. And what was C? There we go, -4. Now we're just going to work this out. What's -4 times -4? Okay, somebody said 16, so that's good. What's a negative times a negative? Okay, that's a positive. Good job. And what's 4 times 1? Okay, that's 4. And then what's 4 times -4? Good job, -16. And what's 16 minus 16? That's right, it's 0. So if our discriminant is 0, How many solutions do we have? That's right, the answer is 0. So therefore, we've only got one solution. We can find the discriminant. Let's go ahead and complete the whole quadratic formula. And just remember, we're going to do it in 4 steps. First, we're finding the discriminant. Second, we're taking the square root of the discriminant. Third, we're rewriting our formula as negative b plus or minus our discriminant, the square root of the discriminant. And then finally, we'll do the problem twice. We'll do negative b plus the square root of the discriminant and negative b minus the square root of the discriminant. Steps in a little bit better to read format. So first, we're going to find the discriminant. So we're going to figure out what number is lurking underneath our radical sign. We're going to work that little expression. Then we're going to take the square root of that number. If it's negative, there's no solution. If it's 0, there's just one solution. If it's positive, there's going to be 2 solutions. And finally, we're going to simplify our equation. So it's going to be negative b plus or minus the square root of the discriminant. So we got negative b plus or minus the square root of the discriminant. And remember that b comes from our quadratic function. And then we're going to just work this simplified problem twice. First time, we're just going to do negative b plus the square root of d. Second time, we're going to do negative b, or opposite of whatever our b value is, minus the square root of d. Once again, first time we're going to add, second time we're going to subtract. Here's our first quadratic, and you want to start by identifying our a, b, and our c. Make sure that you include the signs. It's really easy not to include the signs. So go ahead, pause the video, and figure out what a, b, and c is, and if you're inclined to, figure out your discriminant. So I've got first set of parentheses being squared for my b, minus 4, minus a, minus c. Once again, everything here comes from underneath that radical sign. So I've got negative 8, negative 5, and negative 2 for b. And I squared 5 to get 25. And then negative 4 times negative 8 gave me a positive 32. Positive 32 times negative 2 gave me a negative 64. And 25 minus 64 is negative 39. So there's no solution. We don't go any further on this one. When you get a negative discriminant with the quadratic formula in this class, that's it. We're done. We just write no solution. And if you want, n/c. Sometimes you'll see it written as n/c. Sometimes you'll see it spelled out as no solution. But a negative discriminant is always no solution. So step 2, take the square root of the discriminant, which we can't do that. So once again, in Algebra 1, we only work with real numbers. Therefore, there's no more work to do because the square root of a negative is imaginary. You got another example. First thing you want to do is figure out what A is, B is, and C is. And then we're going to plug that into our discriminant, which is b squared minus 4ac. And don't forget to include your positive or negative signs here. So just as a way to warn you, you'll have one positive number, two negative numbers. Go ahead, pause the video and see how far you can get on this one. Hopefully you got 1, -1, and -20 for your A, B, and C. So we're going to do our discriminant, which is D times B squared minus 4 times A times C. So let's fill this out. Well, B is -1. So our B, first parentheses is always B. Second parentheses is A, which is 1. Final parentheses, which is C, which is -20. We're just going to plug these numbers and just work away. -1 times a -1 is a +1. We're always following PEMDAS. So before we subtract this 4, we got to multiply 4 times 1, and then we got to take that product and multiply by -20. So what's -4 times a +1? Well, if you said -4, you're correct. Then what's -4 times a -20? Is that going to be positive or negative? If you said positive, you're good. And what's 4 times 20? Ooh, good job, 80. And then what's 1 plus 80? That's right, 81. So we found the discriminant. We used the formula. Discriminant is equal to B squared, this caret, it's just an exponent, minus 4AC. And once again, B, A, and C come from your formula. Here's your A, there's your B, and there's your C. So 1 squared gave us 1. -4 times 1 gave us -4. -4 times -20 gave us a +80. 1 plus 80 is 81. You remember what step 2 is? That's right, step 2, we're going to take the square root of the discriminant. You know what the square root of 81 is? It's 9. But is it just 9 or is it plus or minus 9? It's a more exact answer, plus or minus 9. So we've got our square root, and we said that's plus 9 or -9. What's our step 4? Or step 3, I'm sorry. Step 3? Yeah, step 3. Okay, so now what we have, what we're calling a new equation, but really it's not a new equation, we're just simplifying. And let's back up here and just think real quick about what we've done so far. So far we found this discriminant, right, which is underneath your radical sign, your B squared minus 4AC. So we hadn't touched the B from our quadratic formula, so we're going to write down B plus or minus, and we figured out the square root of the discriminant is 9. And that's all going to be over 2A. So now we're going to plug in our value for B and our value for A. So B, again, over here was -1, and A was 1. So, and we got to remember our signs here because it's easy to make a mistake at this point. So a negative times a negative is what? That's right, it's a positive. So we will have a 1 plus or minus 9 over whatever 2 times 1 is, which is 2. Just once again, recap what we've done. We found the discriminant, which is right here, underneath the radical sign, right here. So we had negative B, and we got negative, and we found our b was -1, so you had a -1, which gave us this +1, plus or minus 3 divided by 2. So we're going to work what's up here first, because we're doing PEMDAS. And your division, or your fraction bar, is also a grouping symbol. So like what this means is we do what's on top of our fraction, 1 plus or minus 3 divided by 2. We do this first, then we divide. This is why we say in step 4, we do the equation twice, once by adding and once by subtracting. And we do this because when you take the square root of a number, we need the positive and negative version of it. So we're doing it the first time with adding. So this 1 plus 3 came from step 3, from right here. So instead of writing it all, disjointed and combobulated and confusing, we just wrote it as 1 plus 3. So, because sometimes this right here, that's confusing. But 1 plus 3, easy. We want our work to be easy. So 1 plus 3 was 4. 4 divided by 2 gives us 2. Now we're going to do it the second time with adding. We're going to do 1 minus 3. We're going to do this part first. Whatever the answer is, we're going to divide by 2. That's a question mark. So it's subtracting. We did 1 minus 3. Well, 1 minus 3 gave us -2. -2 divided by 2 is -1. So our solution is -1, 2. Let's look at another example. It's going to work just the same. We're going to figure out our A, we're going to figure out our B, we're going to figure out our C. So A is our x squared coefficient, B is our x coefficient, and C is our constant. Then we're going to find the discriminant. Remember, our discriminant is what's underneath the radical sign. Once again, it's right here is your discriminant. B squared minus 4AC. So whatever B is, you put it in your first parentheses. Whatever your A is, you put it in your second parentheses. And whatever your C is, goes last. We always follow PEMDAS. So we'll do these exponents first. Then we'll multiply these numbers and subtract whatever we get from our exponents minus whatever we get from multiplying. Well, I came up with 1, -4, and 4 for my discriminant. And then I set it up this way: -4 squared minus 4 A, C. A is 1, C is 4. So again, my discriminant comes from underneath the radical. And so once again, our discriminant is B squared. So our B squared is -4 squared minus 4 times 1 times 4. And also this thing here is called a caret. Carets means exponents. So -4 times -4 is positive 16. And then -4 times the positive 1 is a -4. -4 times 4 is 16. And what's 16 minus 16? Right. 16 minus 16 is 0. So we're moving on to our next step. So we found the discriminant, which is our value underneath the radical sign. And now we're going to take the square root of it. So what's the square root of 0? That's right, it's 0. Because 0 times 0 is 0. Therefore, the square root of 0 is just 0. So we're going to do what we did before. We're going to take our negative b from our quadratic formula, because we had not touched that yet. We had not done the 2a. Then we're going to add or subtract the square root of our discriminant. So we're going to figure out what negative b is. Well, so I'm going to rewrite it as negative. Put my parentheses for my b, plus or minus square root of d, all over 2 times whatever a is, right? That's a, that's b. We got negative 4 for b. And then for a, we got 1. What's a negative times a negative? That's right, that's a positive. And what's 2 times 1? That's right, it's 2. So we'll have, so right here, a negative times a negative is a positive. So we've got 4 plus or minus 0 divided by 2. So that's step 3. So we're going to write it as 4 plus 0 divided by 2, because that's an easy problem, right? Easy. And 4 minus 0 divided by 2, because we want that to be easy. Pause the video and see if you can figure out the solution. We get the solution by doing the equation twice, right? Once by adding and once by subtracting. So with adding, we had 4 plus 0 divided by 2. Well, 4 plus 0 is 4. 4 divided by 2 is 2, which is how we got this 2 here. And then we did 4 minus 0 divided by 2. 4 minus 0 is 4, right? 4 divided by 2 is 2. So we've got one solution, right? Then we went ahead and worked both sides out to help us see that when our discriminant is 0, it's going to touch your x-axis at 2. So just to recap this problem, first we found the discriminant, which was so underneath the radical sign right here, right? See, right here. It's your discriminant. So we figured out that discriminant. We plugged some numbers in. We did some calculations. We took the square root of that discriminant. And then we used the numbers we had not touched, which was negative b and 2a, to create a new, easier to work with equation. So we had negative b plus or minus the square root of our discriminant all over 2a. We plugged in values for b and a. And then we did the equation twice, once by adding and once by subtracting. Both times we got 2, so our solution is 2. So just to recap how to use a quadratic formula. First, you identify a, b, and c. Second, you find the discriminant. Then we check the discriminant. If it is negative, you're done. You say there's no solution. If it is positive, you got 2 solutions. So positive equals 2 solutions. If it's 0, 1 solution. And you complete the formula twice. First time, you take what you hadn't worked with, which would be negative b over 2a, and you're going to add or subtract that square root of the discriminant. When you add it, you'll get one root. or one solution. When you subtract, you'll get another, maybe. Could be the same one. If your discriminant is 0, you'll get the same root both times that you work the problem. If you need help, don't be afraid to ask questions.